Ever wondered how a small island nation became so powerful worldwide? From when England and Scotland joined forces to the peak of Victorian imperialism, this video tells the amazing story of the British Empire. Learn how their strong navy and strategic settlements made Britain a global leader. Get ready to explore the successes, sorrows, and lasting impacts of an empire that changed history forever. The story of Britain is one of the most convoluted histories of any country in the world. Before 1600, England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland each had their own complex histories. It became even more complicated when Scotland's King James VI ascended the English throne in 1603. There were religious tensions simmering, primarily because of controversies over the Anglican Church's Protestantism with Catholic elements. Ireland was still predominantly Catholic, Scotland was Presbyterian Protestant, and England had a variety of faiths. This religious tension was in tune with the period, as Catholics and nonconformist Protestants in England, Scots and Irish felt uncomfortable with the Anglican Church. A century earlier, this would not have been an issue, but now that Ireland, Scotland, and England were under the same king, they had to be friends, and none of them wanted to. This conflict, one must add that the king and parliament were now openly hostile. In 1629, King Charles dissolved the parliament for 11 years. In 1640, when he summoned it to raise taxes to finance a war against the Scottish Protestants, the Parliament allied with the Scots against the king, defeated him in war in 1646, and executed him on charges of treason in 1649. Parliament then proceeded to remove the monarchy, and for the next 10 years, they ruled the Isles as a republic. Catholic Ireland did not like the strongly Protestant English government, and the Scots were not pleased to learn that the English Parliament had killed their Scottish king. So another round of fighting began. Scotland was simply defeated and subdued, while Ireland was virtually annihilated, with estimates of the death toll ranging from 10 to 25% of the population, and all provinces except Connaught being fully confiscated by England. This was not the first time, as in 1609, King James sent British colonists to Northern Ireland to set up the Ulster plantations. By the late 1600s, Ireland was blatantly treated as a colony, not Protestant, not Britain, very exploitable. And we see the same rationale used to the Virginia colony in 1607 and numerous New World enterprises that followed. Back in Britain, Lord Protector Cromwell died in 1658, and the Republic began to deteriorate during his absence. So here's a swerve for you. They requested the king to return. In 1660, the Stuarts returned, but they didn't stay long since King James II was, super Catholic. So in 1688, Parliament veered yet again by inviting the king's Anglican daughter Mary and her extremely Protestant husband, Prince William of Orange, to stage a revolt. A coup is better than an outright civil war, but Scotland and Ireland did rebel in discontent, and England brought the hammer down hard. Meanwhile, in deposing and replacing a monarch, Parliament had all the leverage over the state and essentially invented the concept of constitutional monarchy. The heavy political consequences of that will be seen in the next few centuries. But one direct result was that Dutch boy William's hometown rivalry with France became England's business. And this geopolitical deja vu will be the long 18th century, as France and Britain are in the second 100 years of war, both in Europe and all across their brand new empires. Following the maritime prowess of Spain and Portugal, Britain crossed the Atlantic to get some colonies of its own, starting with Virginia in 1607, and then moving from the Caribbean up the Atlantic coast and around Hudson Bay. In 1664, they seized the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam, which they renamed New York, and by the end of the century, Britain was effectively managing the colony. London and West British ports were full of imported furs, tobacco, cotton, and sugar. Realizing that one could grow money, Britain copied Portugal's colonial model and started buying up Africans in large numbers to be shipped over to work as slaves in the New World. And this was the infamous triangle trade. British guns and textiles purchase slaves who work on ever-expanding plantations, and those crops sell in Europe for boatloads of money. Wash, purchase more slaves. Africans were treated as little more than the raw materials of the empire, tired, starved, and beaten to a pulp. 1/5 would die on the crossing, and the average life expectancy on arrival was only 7 years. This was almost sinful enough to make people pause and reflect before they were reminded of how filthy rich it was making them. The slaves produced money. Money produced armies. Armies built an empire. Rinse, repeat, buy more slaves. In Britain, this cycle paid for improvements in government bureaucracy and overhauled all of finance with innovations like the central bank. And during the 1700s, these early successes just kept on compounding. In 1702, France launched a bid for the Spanish throne, which Britain thwarted by taking possession of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, in addition to annexing Gibraltar from Spain. As a result, Britain now controls who is allowed entry and exit into the Mediterranean. 1740. Because they can, the British fleet dunks the French Navy. 2 years after the battle for control of North America between British and French colonists in 1754, all of Europe was at war with one another. Because of its enormous financial resources, Britain was able to throw unlimited money at the issue. As a result, they conquered French Quebec and the Mississippi River Valley, drove French out of India, and started encircling the entire country. And now they just had to hold on and, of course, they could not do it. Well, when the British decided to impose new taxes on stamps and tea to pay for the ridiculously costly war they just waged, the American colonists were outraged to be treated like, shock, horror, a colony. Thus, they began to pose the existential question of self-governance like, "Hey, King George, what is the antonym for tea?" Yeet! Even worse, France was encouraging them. And when they got ideas, of course, the French Revolution is a philosophical and political doozy all on its own. But what matters for us is that France threw down the gauntlet with basically everyone and conquered nearly all of mainland Europe. Britain survived a continental trade embargo and even repelled an invasion attempt. But their biggest weapon was Napoleon's arrogance, as his empire disappeared in 1815 and the Second Hundred Years' War was over. Point Britain. As the empire was preparing to become the ruler of the world, Britain had to become the ruler of itself, and that was a challenge. Following the Revolution of 1688, Catholic and pro-Stuart rebellions in Ireland and later in Scotland posed a risk of loosening the delicate bond that bound the kingdoms together. So England solved the issue by two means: legal tools and force. England joined with Scotland in 1707 to form the Kingdom of Great Britain, and with Ireland in 1800 to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Where there used to be a system of interlocking marriages and technically sovereign states, there was now just the same kingdom. Nice and easy. This was done forcibly, for a series of penal laws in Ireland progressively stripped Catholics of their property, rights to worship, and political liberties. These laws were repealed in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But as we see with the unchecked devastation of the potato famine in the middle of the century, the government still didn't really care all that much. As is the case from earlier, Scotland got off quite a bit easier. While the agriculture of the Highlands was entirely overhauled with mass evictions, the complete disassembling of the clan system, and a little titch of cultural erasure, the cities in the south had a grand old time, as Edinburgh was the brains of the empire and Glasgow's ships were the heart of Britain's maritime power. Speaking of power, the turn of the century saw the Industrial Revolution, which provided Britain with the means and technology it needed to single-handedly drown the rest of the world. The introduction of mechanized industry and steam power transformed the lives of ordinary Britons by delivering them inexpensive consumer goods while packing them into cities, and in the case of the poor, factories. But it also made Britain the world's maker and, increasingly, its owner. With fascinating new technology like steamships, Britain could maintain a network of colonies, no matter how far apart they were. British sailors could sail to India through Sierra Leone, St. Helena, the Cape Colony, Mauritius, and the Maldives to reach the great wealth of India. However, by the end of the century, after the Suez Canal was opened, you could go from Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Egypt, Aden, and Somaliland, and then proceed further to India, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand without having to anchor at any coast which did not belong to Queen Victoria. In 1921, one could travel from South Africa to Mesopotamia without leaving the British Dominion. The raw scope and diversity of locales at play here is frankly absurd, as it is difficult to discern what is behind this blanket of red covering a quarter of the globe. But that diversity did make its way into Britain itself through communities and art and food from all over, and that does raise some rather prickly questions about who belongs and who owns what. This was a very tangible clash between the concept of all these diverse cultures coming together and the fact that Britain was at the top. However, British and other European empires understood that it was not essential to colonize a country in order to extract profits, and the best example is China, which Britain plundered in the Opium Wars to gain better trading terms and a small piece of land called Hong Kong. Because why bother colonizing all of China when you can just browbeat them into letting you trade whatever and wherever you want? Of course, maintaining these distant territories, safe from other encroaching empires, created a cycle of take it now so no one else can, which the Europeans used to divide all of Africa in 20 years. As we all are aware, it did not take long before they turned those carving knives on each other, and thus the world wars occurred. Yes, they're very important. We're not getting into it. What matters to Britain is that although it did win both wars, it lost heavily in that process. Despite scoring some prizes from the losing empires along the way, it became clear that these colonies, which fought so hard for the British cause and were sometimes in the theaters of war themselves, needed the big reward. Many in Britain were for this, as the process of the British Empire moving towards self-governing dominions had begun with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa in the early part of the 20th century, and the Republic of Ireland in 1922. But after the Second World War, those ideas were at last filtering through to the other colonies, and over the next few decades the empire was disassembled, mainly peacefully, but very carelessly. In general, Britain did not bother where they were drawing the lines or how much of a mess they were leaving behind. Exhibit A. India. This went on through the 1900s and ended rather sadly with the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Established from scratch in the course of a century and a half, Hong Kong had an international character and a genuine fusion of cultures that, for centuries of grandioid dreams, no other colony ever attained. Oh, God, forgive me for this sin, but let me not regret the passing of the British Empire. But I will grieve for Hong Kong. At the same time, in the last days of the century, the United Kingdom permitted Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to establish their own parliaments and to be governed more independently. What does that mean for the future of Britain? We're not there yet, and that is the history of the British Empire. What it all meant and what we should take away from it are the topics of heated academic and public discourse. The ramifications of this history are felt by billions of people on the islands and throughout the world. Its constitutional governance, industry, worldwide networks, violent post-colonial rivalries, riches missing from their native cultures, and a hotly debated notion of British identity. Who belongs and who profits? Even inside Britain, there's a lot to unpack. And with such a vast issue as the British Empire, there are no universal solutions. What shall I say? That's the empire for you.